Story 1. Along for the Ride. Glenn and I always had a knack for adventure, a trait that bound us since our childhood in a small, sleepy town near New Orleans. The town, home to only a few thousand souls, was where everyone knew your name, your business, and if you weren't careful, even some of your secrets. We grew up on tales of eerie, abandoned places, spun from the old-timers' lips, tales of hauntings, of dilapidated places swallowed by time. But the one place that had always captured our imaginations was an abandoned amusement park, a centerpiece in the desolation left by Hurricane Katrina. After years of hearing snippets of stories and whispered rumors, we decided to uncover the truth. Chatter of the place had reached a fever pitch with Glenn, and he decided that it was time to pay the place a visit. I was a little hesitant at first, but finally relented. "Looks like I'm going along for the ride," I told myself. So one dark night we set off, armed with only 2 small flashlights and a ton of adrenaline. Our journey led us through overgrown paths and neighborhoods still bearing the scars of the hurricane, even years after it passed. As we ventured further, the familiar signs of civilization gave way to a haunting landscape of devastation and neglect. Eventually, the skeletal remains of roller coasters and rusted Ferris wheels began to emerge in the distance. The entrance, a once welcoming sight to family and friends, now stood silent. There were signs everywhere warning anyone that approached to keep out. The park, in its prime, must have been a sight to behold. Now, it was a graveyard, the rides twisted and broken, the game booths empty and neglected. Graffiti covered everything, and here and there we saw remnants of plush toys, prizes that never found a home. Glenn, ever the brave one, led the way as we explored deeper. It was deafeningly quiet except for our footsteps, which echoed oddly in the open, abandoned space. Not wanting to be spotted by anyone, we kept our flashlights tucked away in our pockets and relied on the bright moonlight to navigate through the desolate park as quietly as possible. As we ventured into the heart of the park, we began to hear unidentifiable noises. At times it sounded like an old man murmuring. In the next breath, it almost sounded like a baby crying. "What in the hell is that?" Glenn asked. "I don't know, but I think we should leave," I replied back. "No," Glenn shot back with a forceful whisper. "We have to see what that is." As we moved closer to the center of the park, where an old carousel stood like a ghostly monument to the past, the noises grew not just louder, but more distinct. We exchanged uneasy glances, our initial bravery wavering in the face of these unexplained sounds that seemed to be drawing nearer with each passing moment. As we got within a few feet of the carousel, the noises suddenly and abruptly stopped. Glenn and I froze in our tracks, straining to catch hold of any lingering sounds. In that moment, a shadowy figure slowly emerged from the other side. Trembling, we finally pulled our flashlights from our pockets and pointed them towards the figure. The light fell upon a man, though he barely resembled one, standing eerily still just behind the carousel's broken horses. His figure was gaunt to the point of emaciation, his skin pale and clinging to his bones as if he was a walking skeleton. Only the barest remnants of clothing hung from his body, tattered and filthy, barely covering him. Dirt and grime smeared his skin, and his hair was a matted, tangled mess. His eyes were wide and wild, and he began to take deep breaths, as if priming himself for an attack. In his hand, he held a dirty, rusted, jagged knife. Before we could even say a single word, a guttural scream erupted from his lips, piercing the silence like a siren. For a moment, we were frozen, gripped with terror and unable to move. Then he charged. Adrenaline overrode our shock. We turned and ran, the man's howls of rage overwhelming us as we stumbled to escape. We ran without direction, our breaths ragged, hearts pounding in our ears. Behind us, the man's screams grew louder, more desperate. It was a chase for life, a frantic sprint, with survival on the line. We ran, screaming at each other and at the man behind us, terrified beyond belief. Whether it was sheer luck or divine intervention, somehow, some way, we found our way to the edge of the park and were able to find an exit. On the other side, we didn't stop to look back. didn't pause to catch our breath. We ran until the man's screams were swallowed by the distance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, our lungs and bodies could take us no further, and we collapsed on the ground far from that cursed place. We gasped for air, our bodies shaking uncontrollably. The man was gone, and we were finally safe. Reflecting back, years later, it's clear that Glenn and I had inadvertently encountered a homeless individual who had taken refuge in the abandoned park. Over time, the park, which had languished in neglect for so many years, was eventually acquired by a development group aiming to revitalize the area with hotels and new attractions. That night was one of the most terrifying experiences I'd ever had. It was the first and last time I'd ever wander into an abandoned place ever again. Story 2. The Abandoned Cabin in the Woods. A few years back, I woke up one morning and decided I'd go on a day hike. I loved being out in nature, but had very little experience hiking or camping or doing any of those types of activities. Nevertheless, it was a beautiful day, so on a whim, I grabbed a backpack, tossed some food and water into it, and drove out to a trail about 45 minutes from my house. The hike started splendidly, with the beautiful sun cutting through the trees. The trail was surrounded by towering pines and oaks, and their leaves rustled softly in the gentle breeze. Birds sang from hidden perches, and their melodies echoed through the serene landscape. It was a breathtaking, uninterrupted journey through nature, where peace and solitude reigned supreme. At one point, my curiosity was piqued by a narrow path that branched off from the main trail. Without a compass, map, or cell signal, my sense of adventure took over, and I decided to see where it would lead. The path was less trodden, ensnared in thick underbrush and canopied by interlocking branches that formed a natural archway. It felt like stepping into another world. I was so captivated by the raw beauty and the quiet, away from any sign of human passage, that I ventured off the main path 2 or 3 more times, each new route revealing its own secrets. Hidden waterfalls, ancient trees, fields of wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. The allure of these hidden treasures was so strong that I completely lost track of time and my bearings. The further I wandered, the more I was absorbed by the surrounding nature, oblivious to how far I had strayed from my car and the familiar. At one point, I decided to take a break and grabbed some food from my pack. As I sat on a fallen log, enjoying the modest tranquility of my makeshift picnic spot, I heard what I initially believed to be the distant rumble of thunder. Looking up, I noticed that the sky, once clear and bright, had turned ominously cloudy. The light had dimmed considerably, and the birds, once vibrant and vocal, had quieted, as if sensing the approaching storm. A sense of unease settled over me as the reality of my situation began to dawn. I was deep in the woods, far from shelter, as a potentially powerful storm was brewing. In a desperate bid to make it back before the storm hit, I made a terrible decision and veered off the marked trail, taking what I believed to be a shortcut back to my car. But fear crept in as my surroundings became less and less recognizable. The first drops of rain pelted down, a prelude to the downpour that followed. I was utterly lost. I had just begun to go into a full-blown panic when I saw something in the distance. From my viewpoint, it looked to be an old abandoned cabin. Not wasting any more time, I scurried as quickly as I could towards it. Upon approach, I could see that it was dilapidated, the wooden frames rotting away, but it looked sturdy enough to seek shelter in. I rushed inside, my heart pounding, grateful to escape the relentless rain. The cabin was eerie, the air stale and cold. The door hung off its hinges, creaking eerily with every gust of wind, while the few remaining windows were cracked and dirty, barely allowing any light to penetrate the gloomy interior. It was better than nothing, though, and I had to make the most of it. It was late now, and the rain continued to fall. The realization that I'd be spending the night there weighed heavily on me. My best bet was to hope that the rain would eventually stop, and I could find my way back when the sun rose in the morning. As I settled in, trying to warm up, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. A woman's scream, or what I believed to be a woman's scream, coming from the woods, from a distance. I told myself it was just my imagination, the wind, anything but what it sounded like. The screams continued for about 15 minutes, each one more terrifying than the last. My mind raced with the thought of who or what the screams could be emanating from. I was shivering, not just from the cold, but from fear. Then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. I told myself that the best thing to do was to try and get some sleep, even if it was only for an hour or two. As I sat there on the floor, propped up against the walls in the corner, exhaustion eventually began to overwhelm me, and I slowly nodded off. I can't tell you exactly how long I was asleep, but I was abruptly awakened by a piercing scream right outside the cabin. As I leapt to my feet, my heart pounding, I struggled to focus my eyes and survey my surroundings. The rain had stopped, but part of me wished it hadn't. I found myself hoping for the downpour to return, if only to drown out the unsettling noises that now seemed to be lurking just outside the dilapidated cabin. Then, the silence was shattered by yet another scream, this one so close it seemed like it was just outside, on the other side of the wall. I yelled out, "Who's there?" but received no answer. My heart raced. I could hear something moving outside, but I was frozen, too terrified to even peek through the cracked windows. Armed with absolutely nothing, I had no choice but to stay awake and keep my guard up until the sun peeked up over the horizon. And so that's what I did. In the following hours, I never heard another scream, but I never felt like I was truly alone. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I poked my head out of the soaked cabin. I surveyed my surroundings, ensuring that there was nothing there waiting for me to step out. Feeling that whatever had visited me in the night had finally departed, I left the cabin, following the rising sun eastwards, hoping it would lead me back to the trail. The woods seemed endless, but eventually I stumbled upon the trail and encountered another hiker who directed me back to the trailhead. I've never been more relieved than I was that day, emerging from the woods. I was inexperienced, unprepared, and made many terrible decisions that could have cost me dearly. Every year, people venture out in the woods and never come out of them. I was fortunate enough to make it out, but incredibly mad and disappointed in myself for the decisions that I had made. I never found out who or what was making those screams, but one thing's for sure. I never went hiking unprepared ever again. Story 3. Shadows in the Abandoned Hospital. Back when I was 17, my friends and I, who were always up to no good, had our sights set on investigating a nearby abandoned hospital. The place was legendary for its eerie vibe and the stories that swirled around it, stories of unexplained noises, sightings, and the usual stuff that fuels teenage dares. One night, driven by a mix of boredom and immaturity, we finally decided to check it out. There were 4 of us, me, Josh, Nick, and Evan. We parked a little way off and approached the hulking, shadowy building under the cover of darkness. It was a sprawling structure. Its architecture, once a blend of grandiose design and practicality, was now marred by time and vandalism. The outer walls, once pristine white, were stained and peeling, covered in graffiti by trespassers who had come before us. Windows, shattered and broken, left gaping holes that gave the building a hollow, eyeless look, as if it were silently watching us approach. Inside, the atmosphere was oppressive, and the air was thick with the musty scent of decay. Paint peeled in large, hanging strips from the walls, revealing layers of faded colors beneath, while the floors were littered with broken glass, rusted medical equipment, and scattered papers. It was a place untouched by the warmth of life for years, a cold, haunting space that seemed to hold its breath as we moved through it. As we entered the imposing structure, we quickly formulated a plan to explore the hospital. Limited by only 2 flashlights, we decided splitting up would allow us to cover more ground efficiently. We agreed to reconvene in 20 minutes. Evan and Josh, armed with 1 flashlight, chose to investigate the ground floor, while Nick and I, holding the other, ascended the dilapidated staircase to explore the 2nd floor. The upper floor was a maze of long, abandoned corridors and empty rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. We navigated from room to room, our movements slow and cautious. Each step was measured, each breath controlled as we cautiously ventured through the dimly lit, abandoned spaces. Our footsteps echoed unnervingly as we moved, and the beam of our single flashlight methodically cut through the darkness. As we made our way about halfway down the hall, an eerie noise caught our attention from the far end. It was subtle at first, like something being dragged across the floor. Curiosity got the better of us, and we slowly headed towards the sound. But as we reached the end of the hall, the noise abruptly stopped. We scanned the area but found nothing out of the ordinary. Just as we were about to turn back, a loud bang echoed from the other end of the hallway. Whirling around, we caught a glimpse of two shadowy figures darting into one of the rooms. With our hearts pounding in our chests, Nick and I tried to convince ourselves that it was just Evan and Josh trying to scare us. There wasn't anyone else in this hospital with us, right? With hesitant steps, we made our way back down the hall, calling out to our friends, but there was no response. As we reached the room where the figures had vanished, a cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Something didn't feel quite right. Just then, Evan and Josh appeared at the top of the stairs. The realization hit Nick and me like a ton of bricks. If they were just coming up from the first floor, who or what had we seen scurrying into the room? Summoning what little courage we had left, we aimed our flashlights into the room. Instantly, we were all overwhelmed with fear, panic, and terror. There were two dark shadows hovering just above the ground, completely black and devoid of any light. They seemed to bob and contort ever so slightly, as if moved by an unseen breeze. They were darker than the surrounding darkness, and appeared to be intelligent, like they had unseen eyes that were looking straight through us. The sight was so unnerving, so fundamentally wrong, that we didn't stick around to figure out what we were looking at. All four of us turned and fled, screaming and stumbling over each other as we raced out of that cursed place. We ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we were safely back in the car, gasping for breath and trying to process what each of us had just seen. It was the wildest and craziest experience that I can remember from my teenage years. We never did find out what those shadows were, and none of us dared to go back and check. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of those shadowy figures and the unshakable feeling that there is something in that abandoned hospital that my friends and I will never be able to explain.